It's here, ladies and gentlemen. It feels like it's been a while, probably because it has. For me, for this project, there's just a lot to talk about today. Elementary OS 6 Odin. It's here, it's landed, it's on my desktop. So as a project that I've been following for years, literal years now, seeing this desktop evolve from a set of icons that you could download and install on Ubuntu to the desktop and environment and ecosystem of sorts that you see today in front of you, this project's come a long way. I want to acknowledge my bias up front that I do like this project a lot. I like what they do for desktop Linux as a whole, and while you might not agree with everything that the Elementary OS team ship in their final releases, and quite frankly, neither do I for my own personal preferences on everything, but there is a lot to love here in this release. So today's video is going to try and unpack what is new in said release and give you my thoughts and opinions on it. So hop on board, subscribe if you're new, and let's jump into it. Okay, so rather than giving you a history lesson, I'm going to jump straight into what is new in this release. If you want to find out what has happened with Elementary OS in the past and what are the features that have been previously implemented, then definitely go and check out videos that I've done on Elementary OS 5.1. And that was the last major point release that we had from the Elementary OS team, and that was some years ago. So this version, Elementary OS 6 Odin, is based on Ubuntu 20.04.2/3. We do have a fairly up-to-date Linux kernel here that I believe is borrowing from the 0.3 release of Ubuntu. If none of that made any sense to you, that's fine. I'm going to come back to that little dialog box later. So here's how I'm going to break down the video. I'm going to talk about the design changes, then I'm going to talk about overall workflow and efficiency and that kind of thing. I'm going to spend a fair bit of time talking about the changes to AppCenter as well, and kind of the fundamental shift from traditional Linux package management and software installation to Flatpaks. And then I'm going to just kind of give you a quick rapid fire auxiliary round and wrap up with my final thoughts and conclusions and who this desktop might be for. So if you follow along with the time codes down below, hopefully that might help you out. We do have a fair bit to cover. I have some notes over to the side here to try and keep me on track. See how we go. All right, so first and foremost, Elementary OS has always been about that user interface and user experience design. It's one of the things that they spend the most time, at least from what I can see, polishing and trying to get right. Premium among those features is being able to have personalized accent colors and also having the option to have a dark mode. Now, dark mode is something that feels a couple of years old, if I'm being honest, but the implementation here is up to snuff in that every corner of the system has been thought about when you hit dark mode. It's quite easy to just hit the invert button on some colors in a style sheet and expect it all to map out. That doesn't always work, and especially when you're dealing with wacky fonts, other widget libraries, and all kinds of other things, having a dark mode that looks consistent. Fonts are still perfectly readable, controls are still legible, you'll still have the same level of accessibility and visibility in all your controls. That's dark mode done right, and that's tricky to nail, and I'm glad to report that from my experience anyway, over the last week or so of using this system and playing around with it, that the dark mode does look really solid. It doesn't look so dark that you're struggling to see what is going on your computer, but it is a subtle enough dark that it obviously doesn't strain your eyes either. Combine that with the built-in night lights and accent color customization, and you've got one of the prettiest desktops that isn't just trend chasing. I'm not seeing a bunch of translucency or frosted glass look that's very in nowadays. This is the Elementary OS desktop that we've seen for some time now, but it's just iteratively better. The font selection of the Inter font, I personally really appreciate, and I'm glad to see more and more desktops adopting Inter. And you'll notice that here on this virtual machine that I've got it installed on, I have actually bumped up the text to large and also the dock size to large as well, just to make it a little bit more visible for you, the viewer, especially if you're on a mobile device. So all that is to say that the scaling of both text and window controls, I think works quite well. Here's just a quick example. So I installed Firefox from the App Center. I'm going to get to that later. And what you'll notice is that, I mean, apart from the fact that it's not respecting the dark mode, but whatever, we'll get to that. What you'll notice is that the window controls here in Firefox have scaled up because I have enabled a larger window control or larger text size in the system settings. Now, I don't know if that's just coincidence that it's happened that way, but it definitely feels like things are scaled appropriately. If I go to the default scaling sections, especially for the text, to me, this feels very cramped on a 1080p display, and maybe I'm just getting old, but the font sizes and stuff feel quite small. Now, I'd imagine that if you are on a high resolution display, then I think you do get some options here to customize what the scaling is of your desktop. You do only get straight up 1x, 2x, etc. But I think the balance that they strike between not having fractional scaling, as in not being able to run your desktop at 125%, for example, you can get a lot of the same widgets and text buttons. You can scale those up to pretty much bang on what you'd want. For me, the large font on 1x scaling seems to work really well without the overhead of fractional scaling. So all this is to say, the desktop shell looks really nice. It works really well with minimal interference or artifacting along the way. So good job. Let's talk workflow. When it comes to the workflow of the Elementary OS desktop, I have a love-hate relationship with it. Here's what I mean by that. The Elementary OS desktop is designed to work in such a way where it is minimal, it's utilitarian, and it's very well thought out. If you live on one machine or multiple machines that you can install Elementary OS on, you will be a happy camper. As soon as you adopt the mentality of how this desktop works, for example, using keyboard shortcuts, using the flow of your mouse going over to the top left for closing windows, coming down to the bottom to open and close applications. If you're willing to adopt a fairly minimalistic utilitarian way of using a desktop, you'll feel right at home here, and this OS feels more efficient and light on its feet than most. While you can't really appreciate it on a virtual machine all that much, the window animations and everything on native hardware render buttery smooth, and the speed with which apps launch is really nice. You still get that classic window tiling of full screen left and right, and you still get an amazing multitasking view. One thing that I did notice with Odin is that they now have an option that when you open or when you maximize a window, or even if you just enter full screen with a particular application, it'll move it over to a new workspace to leave you with a clear one, which is, I guess, reminiscent of how macOS handles full screen windows. It's not everyone's cup of tea, so it's not enabled by default, but you can use it if it's there. Also, I do want to give a quick shout out to the work that they've done on notifications. The notifications that come in here on the side, they have been redone, and they've got options for quick controls to be built into those now. Handling notifications cleanly is one of my pet peeves. So it's one of the things that it's one of the subtle things that I really appreciate the most about Elementary. Elementary OS have also continued in their mission to try and surface as many keyboard shortcuts as possible to help you get more efficient as a keyboard warrior as well. So when you right click on a lot of context menus, you now see the keyboard shortcuts start populating beside those context menu options. Now, granted, a lot of this work started with the previous release, but it's good to see that continuing into Odin and becoming more widespread across the system. Now, the biggest thing that I really appreciate, and I can't really demo for you because of the fact I'm on a virtual machine, but oh my goodness, trackpad gestures. This is something that we've all been waiting for a long time, but you can see here that you've got quick options to control gestures, what they do, and it's great to see that these gestures actually extend beyond just the desktop shell, and they actually interact with things like notifications or switching between the panels in the app launcher. They feel very baked in, and in the time that I was playing around with it on the native hardware, out of the box configuration of touchpad gestures felt very natural. And it's great to see some of the little animations that come along with that. And the fact that they're mapped one-to-one means that you can drag them back and forth when you're bored, like we all do. It's also worth mentioning that these gestures also apply to touchscreens as well, so that's great to see. The other thing that I really like about the overall workflow of Elementary is they have this little shortcuts cheat sheet that they enable. It'd be great to see like this, but rolled out across, or as an external application that runs in the background that you can trigger at any given time to surface the keyboard shortcuts of a particular application that you have open. I don't know how easy that would be to do. I know Windows and Mac have little applications that you can buy or download that help do that. But that'd be very cool to see, because I love having this shortcut pop up to surface some of the keyboard shortcuts on the system, but it'd be great to see some of those carry over to different applications on the system as well. Now, before I mentioned I had a love-hate relationship with the workflow of Elementary OS. Here's where the wheels fall off a little bit for me. When it comes to interoperability between Elementary OS and another system, you kind of have to either mold other systems to suit how Elementary works, or mold Elementary OS somehow to suit how other system works, if you're jumping between different OSs. Because of the fact Elementary has its own custom language, it has its own design, has its own user experience that's very intentional, very well thought out, and works wonderfully. The problem is that if you, like I do, have to jump between different systems, you end up weirding out your muscle memory quite often. This is a personal gripe, but I think a lot of people relate to it, in that things like window controls, things like maximize buttons, the gripes that a lot of people have had with Elementary OS in the past. While I've never really had an issue with these gripes in the past, given how much time I spend on other systems now, and I'm probably just getting older too, is that the muscle memory becomes really, really well known. So if I can try and customize all of my systems to work in a very similar way, I do. And it just helps me feel productive and keep up to speed with what I need to do without having to think too hard. Basically, this workflow has a lot of intentional design decisions that are meant to help increase your productivity and the fluidity of using your computer. If you are used to using other systems, the learning curve might take a little bit, but once you're there, it's well worth it. If you're jumping between a lot of different systems, you might notice the effect to be a little bit jarring. Right, let's talk about the AppCenter. The AppCenter has undergone a fundamental shift, and that is away from traditional .deb installed packages and towards Flatpaks. Now, this has kind of a whole story behind it that I'm not going to go into now. But essentially, what I'm glad to report is that once you have FlatHub enabled in the AppCenter, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment, it's very straightforward, you have a very well-rounded and really good looking and well populated software store. Honestly, the technological implementation here has been very, very well thought out and very well done. But the first impression of what you get when you open AppCenter is a little yeesh, in that you are left at least on first launch, you're left with whatever applications that Elementary OS apps developers have ported to the new Odin release. Now, at the time of making this video, there were quite a few Elementary OS custom applications in the AppCenter, in the pay what you want model that we have all come to expect from the Elementary OS team. But the problem is that when those are the only apps that you can see on first launch in AppCenter, makes you start thinking that you've arrived at a bit of a ghost town. Now, that very quickly changes if you simply go to the web browser, go to flathub.org, and grab a FlatHub application for the first time. You'll then be using the good old Sideload app that they debuted in 5.1, and it will add the FlatHub repository to the AppCenter. Sideload has been great. It was great when it came out. It still is great. And once you have added one application from FlatHub, it will then be added to that repository will then be added to the AppCenter. So once FlatHub is there, it's a really great system, because here's where the rubber hits the road for me. Elementary OS is not a release that comes out every year. This is something that ticks over at its own pace when it's ready, and the desktop features roll out over the life of the release. And then when those features hit kind of a tipping point, they hold them back and get them ready for the new release. Hence, we haven't really had any feature improvements on Elementary OS 5.1 for about 6 or 9 months now, maybe even longer than that, because it was saving them up to work on them and implement them fully in this release. Now, this can create a problem if you are relying on certain pieces of software being up to date on your desktop. When you are basing an operating system that is 3 years old at this point, the software on that gets pretty crufty and old. But with an AppCenter that is Flatpak first, not only do you get all of the amazing sandbox and security that Flatpak gives you, you also get up-to-date software straight from the developers as soon as they publish an update to FlatHub. So when we think about the longevity of a desktop over years, having an AppCenter that is primarily Flatpak oriented, I think will pay dividends in the long run. So when you go and check out this release, definitely go and float a few dollars when you go and download the OS and support the project for all the hard work that's gone into this. Okay, so the built-in apps that are here on Elementary are on the surface largely unchanged. Now, I say on the surface because underlying a lot of these applications, there's been some significant work, especially on the personal information management side of things, email, tasks, calendar, that kind of thing. First of all, they now have a fully functional online accounts portal where you can actually go ahead, add an online account at the setup of your desktop, and it will actually integrate those into your calendar, your tasks, and your email, which is amazing. Because it was a long time gripe of mine that the online accounts setting in the system settings didn't really do much. The mail icon has a completely new backend that works a lot better with a range of different IMAP accounts based on the Evolution email client's backend. So out of the box, you now have a fully functional and cloud integrated task list, calendar, and email client that all feel and look great in Elementary, which is a fantastic addition. The other apps have undergone some bug fixes, some optimizations, but on the whole, they're mostly the same of what you've come to expect. And a handful of these have transitioned over to being distributed via Flatpak compared to a .deb native install. And I would say the vision would be to move as many of these as practical over to Flatpak over the course of time. Quick word on the integrated file browser. They've made the decision to single-click navigate through folders, but then double-click to launch or to open a particular file. This is to maintain speed of navigation, but not accidentally open files all the time, which I think is the right move. It strikes good balance. And also being able to connect to network shares is a bit more straightforward now. This could have been a feature that was included in a previous release in Elementary 5.1. something, but I'm not entirely sure. I noticed the connect server button down here. It's a lot more visible. And yeah, so I'm guessing that it feels new to me. I don't know if it actually is new, but it's good to see it there nonetheless, because that was a bit of a shady spot for this file manager. All right, so before we get out of here, let's just talk about quick system usage, etc. All right, so after searching and launching and doing all the things that I've been doing throughout this video, we're sitting at about 1.15 out of about 8 gig available for the RAM, and the CPU is hardly doing anything at all. What I will say is that for a system that is running on Xorg and running a few daemons in the background, this system does not use much in the way of CPU cycles for the desktop itself. It's actually remarkably light on its feet for a window manager. And this, I believe, speaks volumes of the optimization work that's gone into the underlying mechanics of this desktop environment. This kind of work is not glamorous. It is very much noticed in the day-to-day though. Those little hiccups that you get between launching an application or dragging it around or resizing it or changing the themes, or all of these little glitches that you notice are noticeably less in this release than they have been in previous releases of the Elementary desktop. Now, I do have some questions moving forward about what the Elementary team are looking to do with Wayland and all of that fun stuff. I do wonder what the Elementary OS desktop is going to look like in approximately 3-ish years when the next major release presumably comes out. Once upon a time, I would have really kicked up a stink with how infrequent Elementary OS's releases are, but because of the implementation of things like firmware update management now built into the Elementary OS desktop, the amazing work that the hardware enablement team at Ubuntu do with providing more up-to-date kernels and hardware drivers directly to their long-term support releases, and the use of Flatpaks for app distribution means that on the whole, you could still have a very up-to-date user experience for all the surface level stuff, even though the core of the system is multiple years old at this point. So yeah, honestly, there's more I could talk about. The parental features that are built into Elementary are nice to see. And there's a lot of other little nips and tucks that have happened throughout this OS over its gestation period. But what I will say is that Elementary OS and the ecosystem built around it is very clean. It's one of the best clean slate desktops that you can get. It doesn't try to sell you anything. It doesn't try and push anything down your throat. It meets you with a minimalistic, utilitarian, here is what a desktop can be. And it's kind of up to you whether you want to get on board with that or not. If you're willing to give it a try, you might just fall in love with it. And if you can get over that initial user experience learning curve, there is a lot to love in this desktop environment. It gets work done quickly and efficiently, and I gotta love it for that.